Good day. Today is 27th September, early in the morning of 27th September to be precise. I have a private engagement that is going to require my personal presence for much of today, and the result is that I'm having to make my program earlier than usual. Now, given always that we have a very fluid situation in the conflict in Ukraine, which has been for many months now, for more than a year and a half now, the main topic of this channel. Well, given that that is so, and given that it is a fluid situation, there's always a possibility that whilst I'm out and about doing my private things, something may happen in the conflict zone, which I won't be able to cover in this program. And this is by no means impossible. A few hours before I was making this program, in fact, in the late evening of the 26th of September, the Russian internet started to chatter with reports of a major Ukrainian attack in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. Allegedly, 50 armoured vehicles were involved, which would have made it a big attack, though not as big as some of the attacks which have happened in the past. It was said that the Russian Air Force was active, artillery strikes were supposedly taking place, intense fighting was allegedly happening, and there were even some reports that Ukrainian forces were concentrating on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region and were preparing an amphibious assault across the river, and that this assault was intended to happen simultaneously with this big advance, or at least attack, by the Ukrainians in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. And this news, this information spread like wildfire. It was all over the internet for about an hour, and then it died away. And then, of course, further reports actually started to trickle in based on contacts with actual soldiers on the front line. And they all said that in reality, the situation in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector, and indeed on the Vremivka salient sector as well, and near Pyatikhatki further to the west, was quiet. That in fact nothing unusual was happening. Indeed, nothing much of anything was actually happening. Now, perhaps more interesting was how many people gave credence to these reports about this big Ukrainian attack. And that tells us that people are nervous and that there is, at the moment, a sense of the quiet before the storm. After all, things like this have happened before. There have been attacks that have suddenly materialized out of nowhere. The Ukrainian forces have launched big attacks, and the Russians usually have some sense of what's coming and are prepared for them. And of course, in this particular case, we've had those comments which were made by the officials of the Russian-backed government in Zaporozhye region, Belitsky and Rogov, our old friends. They've come forward and said that the Ukrainians have been reinforcing their troops in the Orekhov area, in the area of Rabotino and Verbovoye. Vladimir Rogov has said that around 10,000 extra troops have been concentrated by Ukraine in this area, and clearly the Russians are expecting some kind of an attack. And it could be that this attack will actually take place and will materialize and will happen over the course of today. Well, if it does, as I said, I won't be able to cover that in this video. I will have to cover it tomorrow, and for that I can only apologize in advance. The one thing I would say is that if there is going to be another big Ukrainian attack in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector using dozens of armored vehicles, well, I suspect that this would be the last big attack of this nature. They've already been three. There was one on the 7th of June. There was a second in the last week of July. There was a third at the end of August. All of these attacks were unsuccessful. All of them resulted in very heavy losses of equipment and material and men as well. So this would be the fourth such attack. And if 50 armored vehicles did participate in it, it would also, by the way, be the smallest such attack. But if it happens, as I said, it would not be surprising, but it would be, I'm confident, the last in the sequence. There isn't any more time before the start of the autumn rains in mid-October for another attack of this nature. They take time to put together, to put the troops together, to put the equipment together, to sort out the logistical supplies, to prepare the ammunition, to do the reconnaissance, to do all of those things. And besides this, as multiple reports are also confirming, the Ukrainian forces now are deeply exhausted. They lack the energy and the manpower that they had when the offensive began in June. They're almost certainly very short of ammunition by this point. Their air force has been depleted significantly. And of course, their stocks of armored vehicles has also sharply declined. There's been even a claim that Ukraine by now has lost something like 70% of the armored vehicles that it was supplied by the West, though perhaps I should say that I personally think that that number, though it may be true of tanks and perhaps artillery, is not true of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. But anyway, I doubt that Ukraine would be able to launch a further attack after this next one, assuming, of course, that it even happens. Anyway, putting all that aside, the fact remains that in all the areas, in the three axes of the Ukrainian offensive, the Orechov area through Rabotino and Verbovoye, in the Vremevka salient, and indeed in the Bakhmut area, the situation has been relatively quiet over the last couple of hours. The most intense fighting has been taking place in the Bakhmut area, on Bakhmut's northern flank, close to the village of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka. I'm now confident that the reports that were circulating some days ago that the Russians had actually captured this village were wrong. I don't think this village has actually been captured by the Russians. The Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, has never said that it has been captured. So I believe that fighting is still going on in that particular area, but there is no doubt at all that the Russians have conducted a significant advance in this area, and it is in fact the Ukrainians in this northern flank of Bakhmut who are under pressure and who are on the defensive. Elsewhere on the battlefronts, there's been little real news, not much news, by the way, from the Kupiansk-Oskol River area where the Russians have been on the offensive, as I discussed in my program yesterday. Sergei Shoigu has said that 2 motorized rifle brigades of the Russian army have been conducting the offensive near Kupiansk. That gives us a sense of the actual scale of this offensive. We're talking about just 2 brigades, a maximum perhaps of 8,000 men, nowhere near enough perhaps to achieve a significant breakthrough in Kharkiv region, not just with 2 brigades. There are strong reports, undoubtedly correct reports, that there are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops now training and equipping and organizing in the rear, being primed for some sort of offensive which will take place when the Russian leadership, political and military, decides that the time is right. Anyway, before I finish this brief summary of what is going on the battlefields, I want to briefly go back to what President Zelenskyy said whilst he was in the United States. He said whilst he was in the United States that by the end of this year, Ukraine intends to have captured 3 towns. And one of them he identified as Bakhmut. He didn't identify what the other 2 towns were. It is widely acknowledged that one of these other 2 towns is Tokmak, which is, of course, in the Zaporozhye front lines. This is, of course, the town which General Tarnavsky now says is Ukraine's minimum objective, and which he hopes that Ukraine will be able to reach before the end of the year. In other words, midwinter. Now, there have been various reports circulating that the 3rd town is Soledar. This is this small town near Bakhmut. To all intents and purposes, it is a suburb of Bakhmut. It was captured by the Wagner organization from memory in January this year, and Zelenskyy seems to be intent on recapturing this town. And I think most probably, it is indeed Soledar that Zelenskyy meant when he was talking about 3 towns. And of course, that again will tell people in the United States, will ring alarm bells in the United States, telling them about how fixated on Bakhmut and the Soledar area Ukraine continues to be. Well, that's the overall situation on the battlefields. Now, yesterday in my program, I was discussing some of the comments that Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, made in connection with the state of the war and the fact that Ukraine had experienced losses of 17,000 men. I think he made it fairly clear that the losses included both dead and wounded, but that was what we were told the overall losses were. And we've also had comments. We've also had other comments from Sergei Shoigu, with which I will admit that I was unfamiliar. And it is to those comments that I now intend to go. And I think that these comments have not received the amount of attention that they merit, and they tell us a great deal about the overall state of the war and of what Russian intentions are. Anyway, these are the comments that I am referring to, and I'm taking them directly from the Russian Defense Ministry website. And they read as follows. The United States and its allies continue to arm the armed forces of Ukraine, whilst the Kiev regime continues to throw untrained soldiers into senseless assaults and slaughter. Despite the absence of any meaningful results of the so-called counteroffensive, Ukraine's Western handlers are not deviating from their inhuman principle: weapons are the way to peace. Such cynical actions by the West and their henchmen in Kiev are only pushing Ukraine towards self-destruction. Under these conditions, Russia continues to build up the combat power of the armed forces, including by supplying modern weapons and improving the training of troops, taking into account the experience of the special military operation. The objectives can be accomplished if the 2025 action plan's activities are consistently carried out. Now, for me, the absolutely key words in this statement are these: such cynical actions by the West and their henchmen in Kiev are only pushing Ukraine towards self-destruction. Now, Shoigu is Russia's defense minister. He's one of the most senior people in the Russian political system and in the Russian government. And of course, he will be very familiar with the overall planning. And he says that he believes that the West, through its arming of Ukraine, is pushing Ukraine towards self-destruction. And of course, he said this, Shoigu is saying this, shortly after the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, ruled out negotiations, or rather ruled out a ceasefire. He said that there can be no ceasefire. There can be negotiations, but the negotiations will take place. If they do take place, will happen even as the fighting on the battlefields continues. There can be no question of a ceasefire. Lavrov said that the Russians have been led up the garden path too many times to fall into the trap of another ceasefire. And so there'll be no ceasefire. That was what Lavrov said. And of course, we've had the comments from the Speaker of the Duma, Mr. Volodin, and he has said that Ukraine's choice is either to capitulate and accept Russian demands in their totality, or to cease to exist as a state. That was what Volodin said. And now we have no less a person than Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, and he says that the West has put Ukraine on a path to self-destruction. So, three senior Russian officials, Lavrov, Volodin, now Shoigu, are in effect telling us the same thing, that Ukraine, its very existence is now in jeopardy. The war will go on. The Russians are not prepared to consider ceasefires. If there are going to be negotiations, it must be for a settlement of the war entirely on Russian terms, and the alternative is the destruction of Ukraine. And these comments from these top Russian officials are happening simultaneously with the publication by the Russian Ministry of Defense of two videos. Now, these seem to be, well, they're curious videos. They're not videos of the fighting. I'm not sure that they're exactly recruitment videos either. They do have something of that quality. But the point about both of these videos, or rather each of these videos, is that they relate to two prominent cities in Ukraine. One is the capital, Kiev, and the other is, of course, Odessa. And the way in which these videos is presented would give, at least gives me, a very strong impression that the Russians are now treating both Kiev and Odessa as eventual objectives for their military in the conflict. So these are extremely tough words from the Russians. They suggest that the Russians are now not just intending to fight in order to negotiate a better outcome, they are fighting in order to achieve victory. And they've defined what that victory is. It is victory which will be achieved either through the capitulation of Ukraine and its acceptance of Russian terms, or in the alternatively, Ukraine ceasing to exist as an independent state, as a state, and presumably being in its entirety reabsorbed back into Russia. Now, the fact that these three officials are talking in this way, the fact that these videos have appeared, strongly suggests to me that there's recently been a discussion at the top levels in Moscow about the course of the war. This is unsurprising. We've seen the Ukrainian offensive. It's not going particularly well. So maybe this is a good moment for the Russians to come together and hold a council of war and to discuss where the war is going and what their objectives should be. Anyway, I suspect that there's been some top-level meeting in Moscow, probably within the scope of Russia's Security Council. They've decided on what their objectives are going to be, and they've decided that negotiations, realistically, are not going to happen and are not going to result in any positive outcome for Russia, that any attempted negotiations from the West, talk about a freeze and all that, are a trap for Russia, which Russia intends to avoid. And a decision has been made, a political decision has been made, that the only outcome of the war, the only acceptable outcome of the war for Russia now is total and complete victory. And as I will discuss shortly, any attempt on the part of the West to try to negotiate a compromise that falls short of these Russian objectives will no longer be accepted in Moscow. Now, Shoigu did say something else in those words, which I've just quoted. He spoke about the fact that the West is acting in this inhuman way, providing weapons to Ukraine and all that, seeking peace through war, basically, through weapons, providing weapons and all that, that is obliging the Russians to press forward with the special military operation, but the re-equipment also of their military. And he spoke about something called the action plan, the 2025 action plan. And some people have taken those words to mean that the Russians have now an end date for the special military operation, and that end date is 2025. Now, that may be true, but I have to say that seems to me to go beyond the actual meaning of Shoigu's words. He didn't actually say in these words that the special military operation is intended to end in 2025. He said that there was a 2025 action plan, and that looks to me to be a reference to some kind of rearmament plan. And it's been clear for a long time now, following many discussions that have taken place in public in Russia, that this big Russian military build-up, this big re-equipment of forces that's taking place in Russia, is not just intended to win victory in this particular war. It is for the long term. It is based on a Russian calculation that the attempt that was made first by the Soviet Union and then by Russia, starting in the mid-1980s, following the assumption, the rise to power in the Soviet Union of Mikhail Gorbachev, that this attempt that was made to seek some kind of long-term, sustainable peace with the West has failed, and that, in effect, the West once more has and can only be seen as Russia's adversary, and that Russia has no option but to rearm and to basically face it down. And I think that is what that 2025 action plan refers to, a military and equipment build-up up to 2025. Having said that, it's not impossible that the special military operation could end sometime in 2025. As I've said many times, the Russian leadership and the Russian General Staff do not share their plans with me, exactly what they're thinking and what they're intending. I simply do not know. I can very well imagine, for example, that we could see the war proceed in 3 stages. I can imagine, for example, a limited Russian offensive this late autumn and winter after the Rasputitsa has passed, intended to basically straighten out the front lines and maybe to make some gains. And then a much bigger offensive by the Russians sometime next year, perhaps to push the Ukrainians across the Dnieper. And then maybe after the crisis that would result in Ukraine, and perhaps following a further re-equipment that the Russians might still be envisaging, another big Russian advance west of the Dnieper to capture Odessa and Kiev, and to push on perhaps all the way to the Polish border and to end the war once and for all. These are just scenarios. I'm not saying that the Russian plan comes down to any of this. But anyway, these are possible things. Now, before I go over to the topic of negotiations, and more precisely to the thinking of the US government, I should say that there's been a very, very interesting and fine program, one of the series, by Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, in which he has unpicked an interview with a drive by the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov. And I'm not going to go over all the points that Brian Beletic made over the course of his program. What I would say is that it's a most disturbing interview that Budanov has given. As Brian Beletic says, it's obvious when you take back and think about it that Budanov sees that the writing is on the wall. He understands that the Russians have a massive manpower advantage over Ukraine. He understands that Ukraine can't operate its tanks, such as it has, because of the overwhelming power of the Russian artillery and the minefields. He understands that the tanks that are being supplied now by the United States are not going to make any significant difference in the war. He talks a brave talk about more Western weapons being supplied to Ukraine and how that might achieve victory. But like Brian Beletic, I have to say, reading these comments, I don't think they carry much conviction behind them. I think Budanov understands that there is little prospect of the West being able to re-equip Ukraine to the level it has in the past, or even to make up Ukraine's losses. And of course, the manpower losses are irretrievable. So I think, or at least the impression I get, is that Budanov basically understands deep down that the war is lost. And of course, he holds out the hope, as I said, of more Western weapons, of miracle weapons. He talks at length about the drone attacks on Russia, creating a psychological crisis in Russia, which might eventually undermine the Putin government. There have been actually studies, there were reports about this, discussions about this very thing in places like the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian of all places, and the general consensus was that the drone attacks in Russia, far from weakening Russian resolve, are strengthening Russian resolve and are consolidating support for President Putin and his government and for their policy of ending the war with victory. So I think that, as I said, Budanov, who clearly has some understanding of events, however tenuous his grasp of reality can sometimes be, I think he clearly understands that with the failure of the offensive, the war is essentially lost. His big gamble, as I discussed in the past, was his belief, his confident belief, that the Russian army was run down and demoralized and would break under in the face of a Ukrainian attack. If you read the article, the interview in the Drive, it's clear that he no longer thinks that. He doesn't really believe in his Western miracle weapons. He discounts the value of the tanks, for example, the M1 Abrams tanks. And he surely must have realized by now that his drone offensive and his assassination program in Russia are not providing the results that he hoped. And yet, despite knowing all of this, and despite knowing as well, presumably, what the Russian view of the war is, that Ukraine must either capitulate or face destruction, he remains resolved on continuing the war. He opposes negotiations. He opposes any kind of compromise. He thinks only of carrying on the fight. And I suspect that to the extent that he can, he will take action against any Ukrainian official, even President Zelenskyy himself, who might want to go back on that and might open up negotiations. It is an incredibly nihilistic viewpoint, one which I have to say does have analogues in previous historical occasions. You probably have found people like Budanov saying much the same thing in Imperial Japan right up to the end of the Second World War, and indeed in Germany in the last months of the Second World War. There were plenty of people like that around then, and there have been other cases when you found military and political leaders talk in the same way. It seems to me that Budanov has worked himself into the same kind of trap. He has the same kind of nihilistic outlook as these previous leaders in these other countries once did. He's prepared to go on fighting to the very end, even if that results in Ukraine, as we have known it, being destroyed. I have to say, I found it a deeply depressing article. I would have thought that an intelligence chief, which is what Budanov supposedly is, with the kind of information that he presumably has, and with the kind of knowledge that his interview shows that he has, would, on the contrary, be coming to his leaders, to President Zelenskyy, and saying to them, let's talk peace, because we have lost the war. Anyway, that's my take on General Budanov's interview. Now let's talk about all these discussions taking place in the United States now about negotiations, which I've talked about in the past, and we've had two very interesting documents that explain part of the thinking. First of these two documents, which I intend to discuss, is a long article which has appeared on Substack by someone called Leighton Woodhouse. Now, I'm not familiar with Mr. Woodhouse. From what I've been able to understand, he is a fairly well-established freelance writer. He's also been involved with the film industry in some way, or so I understand. And anyway, the key point to understand about him in terms of his position in the political system in the United States is that he's a journalist, freelance journalist, but he seems to be very much on the left liberal political end of the spectrum. And this long article is entitled, "It's Time to Stop Backing Ukraine. There is no victory in this war. There are only bad and worse outcomes." And the article then goes into a detailed discussion about the state of the current counteroffensive. It acknowledges that the counteroffensive is not successful and that Ukraine is bogged down and is unlikely to achieve any breakthrough. The article recognizes that Ukraine is suffering enormous losses and is being essentially destroyed systematically through the war as a nation and as a state. And what is actually very unusual for an article written from, as I said, someone with a left liberal perspective in the United States is that the article also acknowledges that the Western expansion of NATO is an important and essential cause of the war. If there had not been this relentless expansion of NATO eastward and this refusal to discuss with the Russians this extension of NATO eastwards, the war would not have happened. And he even makes this following point: given the history of NATO expansion and refusal to discuss this with the Russians, and given the US's giddy enthusiasm for arming Ukraine, one starts to wonder if war was the entire point in the first place. The US, after all, is in the perfect position to bleed an enemy's army dry without putting a single American boot on the ground. And that, of course, is the article that we're hearing many American political leaders, people like Mitch McConnell, for example, Mitt Romney, others make, that the war is actually a cost-effective way of degrading Russia's military capabilities. As I have discussed in many programs, the reality is the diametric opposite. But anyway, that's an interesting observation from someone who I presume is very much of a Democrat, that the war might actually have been the desired outcome by the United States, and that the provocative actions that the United States took before the war might have been intended to cause it. Anyway, he does then, however, as is so often the case with some people, want to have it both ways. He says that with all that said, those who argue, following John Mearsheimer, who he acknowledges as being one of the critics of the war, of the whole Western approach, in fact, to Ukraine, that the United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for this crisis, failed to appreciate the long history of the region in which Russia has suppressed Ukraine's aspirations of self-determination for centuries. When one takes the long view, the proximal causes of the conflict recede into the background, and the story of Russia as an incorrigibly imperialist power begin to appear less like Western propaganda and more like historical fact. And then there's a long explanation, a long account of Ukrainian history, which is intended to arrive to bring us to the point set out in this particular paragraph, that the Russians have been oppressing Ukraine for centuries, and that this is the ultimate, the true cause of the war. NATO expansion might have been the trigger event, but it is Russian oppression of Ukraine that is the ultimate cause. I'm going to say straight away that I disagree with much of this historical narrative. I think that Mr. Woodhouse is probably venturing into complex and contentious territory, which he perhaps lacks the full knowledge and skill to understand in its entirety. I question, in fact, whether there were Ukrainian nationalist aspirations of any serious extent before the late 19th century, at least in Russia. And I would suggest anyway that his views of the relationship between the Russians and the Ukrainians is, to be frank, a simplistic one. He also seems to be blind to the central importance of Orthodox Christianity in shaping political attitudes in this region. But anyway, I am not going to devote the rest of this video to arguing the history of the events of this conflict or of Russian-Ukrainian relations. This is a very complex topic. It's not the one I want to focus on in this program. The point is the outcome that Mr. Woodhouse is now saying. He accepts that the war is unwinnable. He accepts that Ukraine is being destroyed. He makes all sorts of criticisms of Russia's historical relationship with Ukraine. But he does say this: prior to Putin's invasion, Ukraine had only existed as a sovereign nation for a few decades, but Ukraine's aspiration for self-determination, the moral principle underlying the entire modern international normative order, has been a living force for hundreds of years. Nobody has a moral basis to question the right of Ukrainians to defend their homeland and take back one of the few shots they've had at self-determination in their long history. And the world is right to condemn and isolate Russia for its aggression and brutality, which, of course, just to say in parenthesis, most of the world conspicuously is not doing, perhaps because they don't accept or agree with Mr. Woodhouse's historical narrative of events. But again, as I said, I don't want to get into the detail of this. But having made that paragraph, he then goes on to say this: but none of that means that Americans are obligated to support our own country's financing of this war. Whether wittingly or otherwise, the United States has played a decisive role in instigating this conflict. The blood of tens of thousands of Ukrainians stains the hands of the US government, but ordinary Americans do not share the blame with the spies and diplomats that stoked the war in our name. It is not our price to pay, whether in taxpayer money or in the elevated risk of nuclear war with Russia. Nor, for that matter, should that price be paid by Ukrainian civilians forced into military service and sacrificed as cannon fodder in the Russian minefields of southern Ukraine. Ordinary Americans have nothing to do with this war, and we should demand that our government stop funding it. And then Mr. Woodhouse goes on to say, if the United States ended its support for the Ukrainian military, Zelenskyy would have no choice but to negotiate an end to the war. There is no question that the terms for peace at this moment would be unfavorable to Ukraine. Putin would demand official recognition of his absorption of Crimea into Russia. Ukraine would be forced to grant some sort of legal autonomy to the two provinces of the Donbass, bringing them under Russia's de facto control, if not recognize them outright as provinces of Russia proper. And then he goes on to say, it's unlikely Putin would push for any more Ukrainian territory than he already controls, whether through negotiations or through military action. Russian control over eastern and southern Ukraine provides him with the buffer he needs, and occupying the western part of the country would likely mean battling an intractable insurgency for generations to come. Nevertheless, the United States and Europe should offer Ukraine, within its new borders, admission to NATO and the European Union, if doing so was a provocation prior to 2014. It's a necessity now, and it should make a major commitment to helping Ukraine's economic recovery. In other words, the West German variant, the Korean variant, Russia can keep what it's got. We don't necessarily recognize it as part of Russia, but it can continue to occupy it, as we would say, and the rest, the 80% that's left, well, that can join the European Union and NATO. Now, I suspect that Mr. Woodhouse actually is articulating here a widespread sentiment that's starting to take hold amongst Democrats, amongst centrist Democrats, the kind of people who are very anxious, in fact, for the Democratic Party to retain control of Congress, or at least to avoid any kind of wipeout there, and if possible, to retain control of the White House as well. And of course, he talks about Ukraine, and he talks about it quite movingly at times. He's not indifferent, as so many Western commentators are, about the war, about Ukraine's human suffering. But it's clear that overall his primary concern, again, is with the United States. When he says that Americans are not obligated to support the war, I think he knows perfectly well that he is expressing, articulating a very widespread sentiment that is now taking hold amongst more and more Americans. And I think that the White House, or some officials within the White House, and some people in Congress, including people in the Democratic Party, are aware of this, and the fact that Mr. Woodhouse is, as far as I can see, most probably a Democrat or somebody who is aligned with the Democrats, or at any rate is on the left or the liberal left of American politics, not perhaps the radical left, or what once would have been called the left, but what is called the left today. Anyway, they will probably take note of this article, which has received quite a wide circulation. It's been republished by Zero Hedge, for example. And I would not personally be surprised if what Mr. Woodhouse is actually expressing here is one side of a debate which is currently taking place both within the administration and within the Democratic Party. They sense that the war is being lost. Mr. Woodhouse says as much. They sense that the war is not turning out well for Ukraine. Ukraine is hurtling to defeat. They want to find some sort of way out. Mr. Woodhouse has come up with this long explanation of Ukrainian history, which shows that, yes, of course, Ukraine is a good cause, but ultimately we are, at least to some extent, at fault here also. So let's compromise, let's come to a deal, and let's give Putin what we assume he wants, which is eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Crimea, and perhaps the land bridge to Crimea. And then we can walk away, we can say that Ukraine itself has been preserved, that Ukraine, with its supposedly centuries-old history of seeking self-determination, has been preserved, and this nation, Ukraine, can then join the EU and NATO, thereby preserving the principle of the so-called open door to these two organizations, a principle which, as I have said many times, does not in reality actually exist. And we can immediately spot the flaws, because he says it's unlikely Putin would push for any more Ukrainian territory than he already controls. And he says that Russian control over eastern and southern Ukraine provides him with the buffer zone he needs, and occupying the western part of the country would likely mean battling an intractable insurgency for generations to come. The last is a massive assumption. And, of course, what would make the Russians probably decide that even if that was a real danger, which I don't think they believe that it is, what would make the Russians probably anyway decide that they have no realistic option but to go on pushing westwards, is precisely the other part of his proposal, that the war is frozen and that the rest of Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, then joins NATO and the European Union. The Russians have repeatedly ruled it out. Mr. Woodhouse acknowledges that they have seen this as a massive threat to themselves and an extreme provocation. But he doesn't seem to follow through with the logic that must follow from that the only deal that is acceptable to the Russians is one where Ukraine remains outside NATO, and by this point, I'm guessing, the European Union as well. But anyway, there we are. that's what Mr. Woodhouse says. He finishes by saying that no fair-minded person is happy about these grim prospects for Ukraine, but as one of the two countries capable of ending the conflict, it's time for the United States to take stock of reality and accept that there is no winning this war. And in fact, he says elsewhere in his article, that if the war continues, then because of its much greater power, Russia eventually will win. And he goes on to say, our generals, our diplomats, and the American elite will be the last to accept this. Left to their own devices, they will allow the fighting to go on forever. It's time we force them to make a different choice. So that looks like a challenge from someone aligned with the Democratic Party, telling the administration the war has to end. This is becoming increasingly unpopular with the base, the Democratic Party base, as well as indeed with the Republican base, maybe not to the same extent so far, but perhaps increasingly so over time. He's expressing the doubts and uncertainties that some Democrats are presumably beginning to develop about the war, and they're telling their leaders in the Democratic Party, the White House, that this has to end. They're wildly, absurdly out of touch, it seems to me, with Russian thinking about this, but I can't help but think that these sentiments almost certainly are gaining traction, and this is one reason, and perhaps a key reason, why people like Sullivan and Blinken, who must be aware of this sentiment growing, why they're coming round to this freeze idea. Amongst people like Mr. Woodhouse, the freeze looks like a reasonable, rational outcome. Doesn't occur to them that it might not seem so to the Russians, whose objectives they misunderstand, but one can see why they might believe that it is a rational outcome. And of course, it would be a good outcome for the United States. And for that reason, among so many others, we see the shift within the administration. The debate about the freeze, it seems to me, is no longer confined to a small group in the White House and the State Department and perhaps the Pentagon. It's now clearly spread and is starting to exact or draw in people from outside the circle of power. Anyway, that's Mr. Woodhouse. As I said, I don't know how influential he is. I don't know whether he has any contacts within the administration. But I think the fact that an article like this is appearing is, if you like, a very important straw in the wind. Now, there is another document which also tells us that the United States, or at least the ascendant group in power in the United States, for many of the same reasons that Mr. Woodhouse want to see an end to the conflict. There is another document which shows that they do want to see an end to the conflict. Now, a Ukrainian newspaper, Ukrainsky Pravda, has published a letter sent to the Ukrainian government by Mike Pyle, the White House Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. And in fact, the letter has been sent to the Donor Coordination Platform with a list of the reforms that Ukraine must implement in order to continue receiving military assistance. And the letter has also been sent to Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal and to Zelenskyy's office. and it outlines a timetable for these changes to take place. 3 months in some cases, 3 to 6 months in some others, 1 year in a few cases, and 18 months altogether. And it wants changes to the supervisory boards of state-owned businesses, anti-corruption bodies, the High Council of Justice, and the judiciary in general. It wants changes in the work of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense and all law enforcement agencies, including the SBU. And these are 1-year priorities. And it is a pretty tough letter, and it runs to 5 pages. The point to make about all of this is that these are reforms which Ukraine cannot implement in anything like the kind of timescales that this letter sets out. It's simply unrealistic to demand that Ukraine carry out all of these incredibly detailed reforms. Some of them are really extraordinarily detailed. I'll just give one example. It says that within 1 year, the Ukraine must strengthen the Asset Recovery and Management Agency, amend the law to allow for an open, competitive and merit-based selection of the leadership with required integrity checks, ensure new competition for leadership within 1 year, improve the effectiveness and transparency of the management and disposal of seized and confiscated assets, or any within ARMA, this organization, or any other state institution assigned this function. And then you have incredibly complicated things about reforms of Ukraine's constitutional court, its accounting chamber, implementing natural gas and electricity tariffs, liberalization, in other words, raising prices for gas and electricity on the population. And it says that Ukraine must implement a roadmap to liberalize gas and electricity prices to better ensure energy savings and the financial sustainability of companies and operators, while developing targeted support schemes for vulnerable customers in the context of electricity subsidy reform. Take steps to further liberalize gas and electricity prices and prepare for green energy generation and EU-Ukraine energy grid integration. Accompany liberalization with social protection mechanisms to mitigate impact on the poorer sections of the population. It is impossible to overstate how incredibly controversial a reform of this kind would be in Ukraine. But anyway, this letter demands lots of reforms of this kind. It talks about the Ministry of Defense. It says that without undermining readiness, the Ministry of Defense must redesign both military armament and public procurement processes and procedures reflecting NATO standards of transparency, accountability, efficiency, and competition in defense procurement. Adopt legislative national security omnibus amendment 4210 that strengthens democratic civilian control and oversight of the military, modernizes command and control architecture in accordance with NATO principles, and transforms governments and defense planning processes to increase interoperability with Ukraine. Transform defense planning and resource management systems to increase transparency, reduce corruption, and increase interoperability with NATO. Redesign both military armament and public procurement processes and procedures reflecting NATO standards of transparency, accountability, efficiency, and competition in defense procurement. All of this, by the way, essentially says that Ukraine must now buy Western, principally American weapons, but that's basically what it says, and forget about its own military-industrial complex. And then it goes on to say, modernize human defense, human resources resource service management and military education systems to align with and reflect native principles, standards and doctrine, invest in women, peace and security initiatives. All of this ought to be done within 1 year, and this is only one reform amongst countless others. There need to be economic reforms as well, and as I said, some of these reforms must be carried out within 3 months. And apparently the continuation of military aid is dependent on Ukraine implementing these reforms, military and financial aid. Now, I have to say, I think that Zelenskyy and his Prime Minister, Mr. Shoigu, reading this document, I mean, they will be rolling their eyes, and I'm sure they'll be saying to themselves, they'll be seeing in this letter a further step by the United States to start distancing itself from Ukraine. The United States, in effect, providing itself with an excuse to end its support for Ukraine. Because there's no realistic way that in the middle of a war, Ukraine can do much of any of this. The Ukrainians know it, the Americans know it, and as I said, some of these proposed reforms, like gas and electricity liberalization, as I said, they would be massively controversial and unpopular with many people in Ukraine. Now, I want to make it very clear, I'm not suggesting that if Ukraine pushes back on some of these demands, that the United States will end its economic and military support for Ukraine immediately. This letter is not an ultimatum. It is a step away. It is preparing, it is part of the building blocks that are being constructed in order to put the United States in a position where it can tell Ukraine, we've done all we can, we can't realistically do more. You're not listening to our military advice. You're continuing to fight in Bakhmut, not where we tell you to. You're not operating our weapons properly. And you are also failing to carry out the reforms which we deem essential for you going forward. So, Zelenskyy and Shoigu and Budanov and others, I'm sure will see this letter for what it is, a step away, a step towards that point where aid from the United States finally reduces and then gradually ends. So, I come back to the point which I made in a program a short time ago, a couple of days ago. I think we are gradually moving towards the end of the affair. The end of the affair has been defined by Defense Minister Shoigu, by Mr. Volodin, by Sergei Lavrov. Westerners, Americans may not be able to understand this, but it is either Ukraine's complete capitulation or the end of Ukraine as a state. Shoigu has said it again. Ukraine is on a path to self-destruction. And this proposal, this freeze proposal, is unacceptable to the Russians. They've made that crystal clear. And if things continue along the current lines, self-destruction for Ukraine is where all of this is going to end. Now, this is where I'm going to end this program. I said in my last program that I would be dealing with the deepening problems between the United States and the West and India. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time today to discuss those. I suspect that tomorrow, unless, of course, rather the day after tomorrow, unless, of course, there's been some massive development on the battlefronts, which is not impossible, then I will finally be able to come round to it. Apologies to any of you waiting for me to touch on this. I would say that I've covered some of the points I'm going to make in more detail already, that I believe that the issue of the Sikh, of the assassination of the Sikh activist in Canada is more related to India's conduct at the BRICS summit and at the G20 summit than it is about that incident itself. And I would also reiterate again that there's been a brilliant article by M.K. Badrukumar on Indian Punchline in which he explains it all extremely well. But anyway, I will come back to it, as I said, in my next program tomorrow, and you'll have to wait for me to discuss it then. In the meantime, let me finish by saying, repeating the point that I've made before, all these discussions, Mr. Woodhouse's discussions, other discussions about a settlement freeze are not only beside the point, these are not proposals the Russians are going to countenance, they are now being made far too late in the day. The Russians have reached a political decision. The fact that we've had 3 statements from 3 top Russian officials, Lavrov, Volodin, and now Shoigu, essentially pointing in the same direction, make that clear. The Russians have reached a political decision that they're not going to stop the war until victory is achieved. And victory is an outcome which will be defined by themselves. And if Ukraine is not prepared to come to terms on the basis of Russian demands, well, they've already defined what one version of victory would be: the end of Ukraine as a state. That is the stark reality that Ukraine is facing, that the West is facing. The time window has all but shut. I suspect that if there was a letter from the White House to the Kremlin tomorrow in which President Biden were to say that the United States now realizes that there is a need to discuss a new security architecture for Europe as a means of achieving peace in Ukraine, I think perhaps if Putin was to receive some kind of a communication of that nature, he probably would agree to talks. Though the talks, in my opinion, would have to be with the United States, not with Ukraine. I'm sure Putin would insist on that. But Lavrov has ruled out a ceasefire, and I think that will stick. The Russian build-up is becoming overwhelming. One particular point with Budanov's article, further point with Budanov's article, interview with the Drive, with which I disagree, by the way, is that he seems to assume that modern warfare means that armor defensives are no longer possible. I disagree. I think that they not only are possible, I think the Russians will eventually launch them, but of course they will launch them in a completely different kind of situation than the one which we have seen Ukraine trying to launch over the last few months. Because when the Russian offensive comes, it will come with overwhelming force on a scale that will dwarf anything that Ukraine has attempted to do up to this point. So that is the reality. People in the West are still struggling to accept it, but it is a reality that is looming over the horizon, and perhaps the war will end in 2025, but I suspect that 2024 will be the year when it becomes clear, impossible any longer to deny what the outcome will be. Well, that is me for today. As I said, with apologies, in case, as I said, I miss some big event over the course of the day, or to anybody who wants me to comment about the Indian-US relationship. But anyway, this is where I end today. It only remains for me to wish you, again, a very good day, to remind you that all our programs can be found on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X, the former Twitter. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop. Links to these under this program. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.